In the last chapter, in chapter number 3, we see that Paul, in addressing the churches of Galatia, reminded them of their duty to serve the Lord according to the true gospel, and not to according to some perverted gospel that might include the works of men. He brings into play Abraham, like he does in the book of Romans, and like the author of the epistle to the Hebrews does in that epistle as well, bringing their father Abraham after the flesh into the debate, you might say. I don't know if it's fair to call it an argument or not, and his proof is that Abraham was saved by faith, not by works. He predated the law. The law had no, the Mosaic law, the ceremonial law had no, didn't play any part in the salvation of Abraham. And though he's considered faithful and obedient to the Lord, still it was his faith in God that amounted to his salvation, his faith in the righteousness of Christ, the coming seed, that amounted to his salvation, or that led to his salvation. So he talks about the children of faithful Abraham being those that have faith in God, even though there are some that physically are the seed of Abraham after the flesh. The ones that are the promised seed singular is Jesus Christ, but those that would be the children of Abraham spiritually are those that are the children of faith, those that have faith in that seed, Jesus Christ. So then we begin in chapter number 4. He says, "Now I say that the heir, as long as he is a child, differeth nothing from a servant, though he be Lord of all." Okay, so there's the heir that has not yet reaped the fullness of his inheritance. He's as a child, and Paul's given us a picture here. Remember, the chapter breaks are something that are added later. He's talking about the Abraham's seed and his and the heirs according to that promise. These heirs, he's now going to make a comparison to like an earthly heir to an inheritance while he's growing up. He's not much different from the servant, even though he is destined to be the Lord of all, even though he is the inheritor of greater promises than others. Not much difference between him and the servant while he's growing up, but is under tutors and governors until the time appointed of the Father. So the children and the heirs according to the promise are destined or fated to inherit the kingdom of heaven. Great possessions in heaven, even, you might say. But while they're growing up, and when the inheritance is not granted theirs in fullness as of yet, they're not much different from the servant, but they're kept under tutors and governors until the time appointed of the Father. They're properly taught and reared up. And in effect, this is what we're talking about here. This is what the law did. It was the tutor and the governor until the time appointed of the Father. I don't know, there's a lot of, I don't want conjecture or raise a lot of hypotheticals, but the coming of Christ wasn't at the very beginning of God's covenant with men. It took place about 4,000 years after creation. So those 4,000 years that preceded Christ, especially the 1,000 or so that preceded Christ after the coming of Moses, these were kept by this written law, and this Mosaic and ceremonial law was meant to be the tutor and governor until the time appointed of the Father. But what I'm trying to say is that the coming of Christ isn't at the very beginning of God's relationship with man. It comes somewhere, some many centuries after man comes to the earth. So there has to be some that precede the coming of the promised one. And what is their condition? They are kept under tutors and governors until the time appointed of the Father. They're properly taught and reared up, just like an earthly heir would be taught and reared up before such time that the inheritance is granted to him in fullness. He's still the heir, just like those before Christ. They're still the heirs according to the promise. It's just that the promise isn't as clear to them. It's not been entirely granted to them in an apparent fashion as of yet. And that's because the promised seed, hasn't yet come. Even so, when we were children, were in bondage under the elements of the world. Now, a lot of times we take this, again, if you don't read the entire epistle or link the chapters together, and break it up too much. We take verse 3 and we apply it strictly in a personal fashion to our own sinfulness, and you can apply it that way, but that's really not even the primary application. Even so, when we were children, were in bondage under the elements of the world, and we'll say, well, before we knew Christ, we were bound to serve sin, which is true, and you can apply it that way, but that's really not the application here. Paul's talking about, I think, Judaism, and those that are the children of Israel. They were children, they were in bondage under the elements of the world. The elements of the world here not implying sin per se, although what they did was sinful. It implies that they were in bondage under the rudiments of the law. The religion of the Jews, which had its root in Moses, but became eventually just mostly the traditions of men and the religion of the Jews. But even if you apply it to the Mosaic law in a strict and proper fashion, something that men were meant to labor under, we were bound by that law. We were being taught. And we were under tutors and governors until such time as the seed should come. But when the fullness of the time was come, God sent forth his Son, made of a woman, made under the law. That's why I think that verse 3 applies mostly to the Mosaic law, not sins, the sins of the world, which we were in bondage to before we were saved. We're talking about a people, though, that even those amongst them that were saved, they were under this the law of Moses and under the Mosaic law until such time as God sent forth his Son, made of a woman, made under the law. He was subject to the law. That's why I don't want to spend too much time on this, but that's why verse 4 I think is partly proof why verse 3 its main primary application isn't to the sins of the world, because we labored under the elements of the world. And if that applies only to our natural physical condition before that we're saved, and how that we're servants of sin, then that makes verse number 4 seem like the Son, when he came, was made, that he was under bondage to sin, and he wasn't. He was made under the law, but he was never in bondage under the elements of the world, in the sense that he was in bondage to sin. But he was obedient to the law, just as we were in verse number 3 when we were children, before that the fullness of time was come. And so Christ comes at the end of the law, made under the law, to redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons. Okay, so he is just like Abraham is the father of the faithful, in that he was saved. He was saved before he was ever circumcised. He was saved before ever the law came. He was saved because he believed in God, and that was counted to him for righteousness. And therefore, he can be the father of the faithful, both before the law or outside the law, and also those that are his physical seed, those that believe there. He's also their father as well. But he's the father of both, whether they're under the law or outside the law. Well, here we see that Jesus Christ comes, and he comes under the law that we might receive the adoption of sons. He's the children of. He is the redeemer of those who are under the law, or those that are Gentiles, as you can see. He says, okay, so he says, he's made of a woman, made under the law, to redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons. In other words, our victory is in him. It isn't in our own obedience to the law. We sought redemption. We sought salvation through the rudiments of the law. We were in bondage under the elements of the world, and we sought salvation there as those that sought to please God. And primarily, he's talking about the Jewish nation and the children of Israel. But redemption wasn't found. So Jesus Christ came, and he came to redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons. And remember, this is God's plan, because it says in verse 4, when the fullness of time was come. And because ye are sons, God has sent forth the Spirit of his Son into your hearts, crying, Abba, Father. Okay, now some will debate whether or not the Spirit indwelt the Old Testament saints under the law. I personally think he did. But in this case, I think what we're being told is, because ye are sons, God has sent forth the Spirit of his Son into your hearts, crying, Abba, Father. I just think the relationship is different. in the sense that now the Spirit of God that we have brings to us Christ, and our relation to God as our Father in heaven is made so much clearer and so much plainer. This is what happened when the fullness of the time was come. And the Spirit has made this relationship, the difference in this relationship plain to us. It's not that we're any more saved, it's just that there's more clarity here. And you might say that the relationship is nearer and dearer instead of being instead of being under the law, even though that we believed in God, and that's counted to us for righteousness, still there's more of an attitude of being a servant only because the fullness of time has not yet come, and we're kept under tutors and governors, and the relationship is more of a servant to a master. Now it's more of a son to a father, I think. That's what Paul says in verse 7, "Wherefore thou art no more a servant, but a son. And if a son, then an heir of God through Christ." There's a lot of servants that aren't really servants, that were just laboring in their service, seeking to save themselves through their work. But there were some that believed in God, and that was counted to them for righteousness, and still yet they must labor as servants because they were under tutors and governors until the time appointed of the Father. He says in verse 8, "Howbeit then, when ye knew not God, ye did service unto them which by nature are no gods." Now the tutors and governors in the law that came to us taught us that we needed to serve God, and many thought that they were serving God, when in fact they did service unto them which by nature are no gods. Their service was rendered either entirely in the rituals and traditions of men, and their own goodness and their own righteousness was their aim, or their minds were even further perverted, and they would worship and serve false gods, seeking to give them their service and to give them their worship. But now, after that ye have known God, or rather are known of God, how turn ye again to the weak and beggarly elements whereunto ye desire again to be in bondage? That proves to me, I think, that verse 8 is primarily talking about how that the Jews traditionally and in the past had perverted the law, and their relationship with God was based more on their own efforts and their own works to save themselves. They weren't successful, but now after that ye have known God, after that the time appointed of the Father has come, and the fullness of time has now come, and God sent forth His Son. Now, after you've known God, or rather are known of God, how turn ye again to the weak and beggarly elements whereunto ye desire again to be in bondage? See, that's what we talked about in verse number 3. "Even so we, when we were children, were in bondage under the elements of the world." So this is before they'd grown up, you might say, in the faith. The weak and beggarly elements that they were under before weren't able to save them. He says in verse 10, "Ye observe days and months and times and years." And this isn't just those that are a part of the Mosaic law, or those that are on the Jewish calendar that ought to be, that were maybe commemorating historical happenings and things like that. But these were days and months and times and years that they would observe in a religious way, and impose those traditions on others in order to accomplish their salvation, in order to increase their accumulation of good works. "I'm afraid of you, lest I bestowed upon you labor in vain." That's a pretty scary verse for Paul to write these words, right to the churches of Galatia. "I'm afraid of you, lest I bestowed upon you labor in vain." Now maybe it's meant to frighten them. Maybe it's meant to draw their attention to the fact that they have been observing days and months and times and years, the fact that they have turned again to the weak and beggarly elements that they desire to be in bondage unto. And just like he said in verse 6 of the first chapter, "I marvel that ye are so soon removed from him that called you into the grace of Christ into another gospel, which is not another, but there be some that trouble you." And these ones that troubled them were the Jews, and would pervert the gospel of Christ, and they would try to incorporate works, and they would try to incorporate weak and beggarly elements into their religion, to observe days and months and times and years, and instead of just preaching and teaching and trusting in the grace of Christ and the true gospel of the grace of God. "I'm afraid of you, lest I bestowed upon you labor in vain." Perhaps you're still amongst those that trust in works and not in grace. Brethren, I beseech you, be as I am, for I am as ye are. Ye have not injured me at all. Verse 12 is a bit, that's interesting. I'm not sure entirely what all he's saying here. Of course, you know, every passage of Scripture is that way, but he says, I beseech you, be as I am, for I am as ye are, and ye have not injured me at all. He might be pointing to the fact that I'm a Jew just like you. Be like me in the sense that that I preach the gospel of Jesus Christ, unadorned with works. You know, trust in that grace of Christ and that grace of God rather than in your works. I am as ye are. I'm a Jew like you, and it's by God's grace that I am what I am. You have not injured me at all. You might say that you haven't prevented me from preaching the gospel through your feeble attempts, or you might say that you've not insulted me at all because I'm ready to forgive. Or, you know, it doesn't matter what you say. You could look at it this way. I'm still going to preach the gospel of Christ, and you're not going to prevent it. You know how through infirmity of the flesh I preached the gospel unto you at the first. Even though he wasn't, his presence wasn't what his words were weighty and powerful, but his presence was weak. You know, and sometimes folks get the idea that perhaps he wasn't as much of an orator, or he wasn't as much of a commanding physical presence as what, say, Apollos was, or maybe Peter. But I don't know those things. But he says, you know how through infirmity of the flesh I preached the gospel unto you at the first. Doesn't matter how great and powerful, doesn't matter how impressive he is as an orator, still we're all pretty infirm and weak when we're confronted with this in comparison to this gospel. The gospel works in the souls and the hearts of men, and no matter how our flesh might seek to impose our will upon you, it is the gospel that matters, and it is the grace of God that matters. And then he says in verse 14, "In my temptation, which was in my flesh, he despised not, nor rejected, but received me as an angel of God, even as Christ Jesus." And again, he has this physical detriment. My margin calls it Paul's thorn in the flesh, which is referred to over in 2 Corinthians chapter number 12. And whatever this might have been, whatever this impediment or weakness might have been, they didn't despise it, but they received him as an angel of God, even as Christ Jesus. You know, they were gracious to him because God's Spirit worked in them, and they accepted his preaching and believed him and rejoiced in what truths he brought to them. He said, "Where is then the blessedness ye spake of? For I bear you record that if it had been possible, you would have plucked out your own eyes and given them to me." His thorn in the flesh, some folks think it was a speech impediment. Others think that it might have been weak and poor eyesight. And that might be why that it's mentioned here that they would have plucked out their own eyes and have given them to him so that he could see better than what he could currently. And I don't know what it is. But I think that what's being said here is that no matter what the physical ailment was, this is given as an example. It could have been the eyesight that it was his problem, but what Paul's saying is that you were so gracious towards me that no matter what, they would have done anything, even to the point of plucking out their own eyes and giving them to him. That was the blessed condition that they were in. It says, "Am I therefore become your enemy because I tell you the truth?" Maybe in these verses 12 to 16, maybe he's doing a little bit of what he's done before when he was building up his resume, you might say, and establishing himself as an apostle of Jesus Christ, just as certainly as any other apostle. And apparently they had accepted him as such before. He said, "Am I therefore become your enemy because I tell you the truth? Shouldn't you still be listening to me, the one that you blessed and the one that who you rejoiced in earlier?" I'm not going to get into this, but truth has a way, I think, of causing division. You tell the truth, and it can cause division. Jesus Christ did that, and it caused much division. We do that, and it causes much division. Even amongst those that are saved sometimes, even in the churches of Christ, such as these churches of Galatia, sometimes the truth can cause division because some will be offended, and they know that they have violated these truths or ignored them or belittled them, and others will be repentant and have a godly sorrow and seek to return to the truth? Am I therefore become your enemy because I tell you the truth? All right, so if I am your enemy, it's because you're not accepting the truth is another way to look at this. It says, they zealously affect you, but not well. Now, they is probably referring to the Jews again. They zealously affect you, but not well. Yea, they would exclude you that ye might affect them. You know, they want them to return to Judaism and the works of the law. But it is good to be zealously affected always in a good thing, and not only when I am present with you. Okay, zeal itself is good, but it should be zeal towards God and zeal towards the proclamation of the grace of God. It's good to be zealously affected always and then if you look here, it says a good thing. A thing is both in italics. It's good to be zealously affected always in good. To be zealously affected, to be full of zeal and vigor in good. And not only when I'm present with you. You don't need the Jews to incite you to zeal when I'm not here. You should be zealous always in good. My little children, of whom I travail in birth again until Christ be formed in you. He's continually going to admonish these people. Perhaps there are some that were professing salvation that weren't truly saved. Well, you could look at this verse this way. He's going to preach to them until the Lord does truly save them. That might be one way of looking at it. But I think really what he's talking about is he's addressing the ones that are truly saved, who have gone into error in some way, and he's going to travail in birth with them again until Christ be formed in you, or until Christ be perfect in you, or that you grow mature in Christ, that you mature in the service of Christ and in the church of Jesus Christ. I desire to be present with you now and to change my voice. And here's this phrase, a similar phrase. He says, for I stand in doubt of you. So he says, I stand in doubt of you now, which is pretty frightening as well. In verse 11 he says, I am afraid of you. Verse 20 he says, for I stand in doubt of you. Maybe just because he's heard things that make him doubt. Or maybe because he legitimately doubts the salvation and the service of some. Anytime our service is delivered to God in such a fashion that anyone might doubt our salvation, it's probably proof that we're not exactly the servants that we ought to be. I mean, even the world should be able to see in us that we're the servants of the God that we serve. Even though they may not know that God, even though they may not agree with our service, they ought to at least see that we're faithful to the tenets of our faith and the practice of our religion. And if we're not faithful in it, then even if they don't agree with us and find us repugnant, at least they ought to see that we're faithful to our ideals. And we don't want them to stand in doubt of us. It's even worse, though, if this apostle writing this epistle to them would stand in doubt of their salvation, or stand in doubt of their sincere desire to serve the Lord. Tell me, ye that desire to be under the law, do you not hear the law? This goes back to what we talked about in chapter number 3. The law is meant to condemn, and it shows men their sins. And if you're going to spend all your life, all your effort, all your religious zeal on obeying the law, you're rendering your service to that which in the end will condemn you, because you cannot keep it completely. Do you not hear the law? Don't you know what it says? And if you want to be under that law, and if you want the Lord to hold you accountable to that law, that's a dangerous thing. For it is written that Abraham had 2 sons, the one by a bondmaid, the other by a free woman. This is a difficult allegory that he brings out in the next few verses. Remember, he used Abraham as an example in chapter number 3, and how that he was saved because of his faith in God, and God counted it to him for righteousness, and yet he's considered a faithful man in all his work. I don't want to demean Abraham here, or be seen like that this passage is meant to be critical of him, but he did have 2 sons, and the one by a bondmaid, the other by a free woman. The one was born according to the promise, and the other really was born because of Abraham's desire to help God along in accomplishing his will, and Sarah as well. Abraham had two sons, the one by a bondmaid, the other by a free woman. He was faithful unto God, and he's saved by grace. But we're going to use these two sons that he had, one by a bondmaid, the other by a free woman, as an allegory. But he who was of the bondwoman was born after the flesh. Maybe you could say because of the desires of the flesh. But he of the free woman was by promise. Okay, so that's Ishmael that was born unto Hagar, that was born after the flesh. That's Isaac that was born to Sarah. He of the free woman is compared to the one that's born by promise. So one was a result of a lack of faith, you might say, or maybe an attempt to incorporate works into our salvation as a necessity in order to accomplish God's will. And the other was born strictly by promise. A womb that could not bear, that was barren, was made to bear. Which things are an allegory? For these are the two covenants. The one from the Mount Sinai, which gendereth to bondage, which is Hagar, a desire to work on our part to help God accomplish His will, a religion based more on works and the flesh. That's what Paul's talking about. These are the two covenants. The one from the Mount Sinai, which is so we're talking about the covenant of the old covenant and the law, and we're comparing it to what Abraham and Hagar and Sarah did in the birth of Ishmael. For this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and answereth to Jerusalem, which now is, and is in bondage with her children. So he's kind of stretching the allegory now to include all of those that labor under the law, even those in Jerusalem now, who were in bondage under the law because that's what they labored under. That's kind of odd here, but what he's doing is he's comparing Hagar to Judaism and Abraham's relationship with her to Judaism. And they remained in bondage with her, and that's the same bondage that the children of Israel were existing in even now. The Jews were existing in even now in the time of Paul. They were in bondage with their children. But Jerusalem, which is above, is free, which is the mother of us all. See how interesting this is, how that Abraham had these two sons. We already talked about how that he's the father of the faithful. Well, he is the father, the physical father of Israel. But in a sense, he's the spiritual father of all of those that believe and have faith in God. But Jerusalem, which is above, is free, which is the mother of us all. And they were free from the bondage of the law. They weren't in bondage under the elements of the world any longer. That's the son of Sarah. That's Isaac, the son of the promise. And that's compared to Jerusalem, which is above, which is free, which is the mother of us all. For it is written, rejoice thou barren that bearest not. So that's a reference to, you can see Sarah filling that role. Break forth and cry, thou that travailest not. For the desolate hath many more children than she which hath an husband. So if you follow the lineage down through Abraham to Isaac to Jacob and all the way down to Christ, you can see that Christ is the promised seed. But you could also see that Abraham's seen as the father of the faithful wherever they are. Far more children than what you could have just after the flesh. Because these that are saved, even amongst the Gentiles who have faith, they're considered the children of Abraham now. The desolate hath many more children than she which hath an husband. All right, so he says, now we, brethren, as Isaac was, are the children of promise. All of those that are saved, even those that can't trace their earthly lineage back to Abraham through Isaac, we are still the children of promise. Because it's this faith in God that is the means of our salvation, and trusting in His righteousness rather than our own. But as then he that was born after the flesh persecuted him that was born after the Spirit, even so it is now. So remember, Ishmael persecuted Isaac, and Sarah said that I'm not going to have it, cast him out. Even now, the children of Israel that turned to the Lord and trusted in Jesus Christ for their salvation, or those amongst the Gentiles that were influenced by the Jews in these early churches, as each of them are saved, they were persecuted by the children of the flesh, which even though they might trace their lineage back to Abraham through Isaac, they still were symbolically more the children of Ishmael, the children of bondage. And they persecuted those that believed in Jesus Christ. And they did it. Ishmael did it then, and the others did it even now. Nevertheless, what saith the Scripture? Cast out the bondwoman and her son, for the son of the bondwoman shall not be heir with the son of the free woman. So you cannot mix, in the churches of Jesus Christ and the churches of Galatia here, you cannot mix an inheritance based on physical effort or your lineage or your obedience to the law. You cannot mix that with the inheritance based on faith in Jesus Christ, and the inheritance which comes to us by the grace of God. So then, brethren, we are not children of the bondwoman, but of the free. And just remember that distinction. You know, we're not children of the bondwoman, but we're children of the free. In the next, we just have 2 chapters left. Just like in most of Paul's epistles, when you get to the really partway through chapter 5 to the end of the chapter, it's going to be a lot more practical. But he's going to deal with a few more doctrinal things here in the chapter number 5 at the beginning, and we'll maybe get into that on Wednesday. I'll stop right there.